What's good, nerds? Welcome to the last video of Socky November, bitches. Whew. I am your boy Jay, the movie monk, the Bishop of Bull Moose, the choir boy of Criterion, and I'm still excited about Socky November. Oh yeah, I'm the Abbot of Arrow too, the Shaolin Abbot of Arrow. And I'm still pretty excited about the theme month, even as it's drawing to a close. I mean, I could probably keep this up through the first half of December as well, because apart from some time I spend with my kids, for the first week or two of December, I'm not too keen on Christmas movies. I will try to wait and sort of push those off till we get a little bit closer to Christmas. Really, it's about mid-month on that I feel Christmassy. But I hope you guys have all had a lovely Socky November as well. I'm wearing my Jack Burton shirt. That's from Big Trouble in Little China, you might recall. You might recognize that. Booyah. And that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. You know, Big Trouble in Little China is maybe a very good example of a Hollywood film in which there was a considerable influence from Hong Kong cinema. Now, you know, Hong Kong, having been a British colony for like nearly the entirety of the 20th century, it had a unique opportunity to consume Western films. Hong Kong was fairly westernized. They were British citizens until I believe the early 80s, and they got downgraded a little bit in prep to hand them back off to China. But Hong Kong did have a heavy Western influence, so they got to see Western films, maybe more so than mainland China. And additionally, Hong Kong was a tremendous exporter of films as well. They exported films starting in late 60s, early 70s. Now, maybe their reach was predominantly regional most of the time. You know, they reached over into Taiwan, and they had considerable reach into Japan, Thailand, etc. It might have been regional in that East Asian region for the most part, but not always. At times, their reach went pretty darn far. I mean, we would not be observing a Socky November if Hong Kong cinema hadn't finally broken into the U.S. market. So today, I want to talk about how Hollywood influenced Hong Kong cinema and how Hong Kong cinema in turn influenced Hollywood. There was a two-way exchange of film influences, as both Hollywood and to a lesser extent Hong Kong were exporters of films as cultural products. And I think that we see those influences in both industries and even up until now, and I will support that in my following discussion, fools. So I cracked my last Qingdao. We're about to get it on, man. Now, at first, in the 1960s, Hong Kong cinema was not having a tremendous influence on what was being made here in Hollywood, which is a way of saying they had no influence over Hollywood in those early days. However, Hollywood did have a pretty big influence on Hong Kong cinema at that time. Now, Hong Kong employed Hollywood classical editing, cinematography. It allowed for continuity between shots, eyeline matching, shot, reverse shot type of positioning of actors within the frame. This is all, you know, lifted straight from classic Hollywood cinema of much earlier decades. Stuff that was developed in the 20s and employed in Hollywood through the 30s and 40s was being used here in Hong Kong as well. You could tell that they had watched their Western movies and they knew about some of these techniques for producing image-to-image, shot-to-shot continuity for the sake of the narrative. Now, consider films like Captain Blood and Robin Hood. They had an obvious influence on the clear, like, good versus evil storylines that were happening in Hong Kong cinema films of the 60s. The swordsmanship, the adventure, that was all swashbuckling, kind of taken from those 30s films from Hollywood. Come Drink With Me is the example that I'll point to here of Hong Kong cinema that was influenced by earlier Hollywood swashbucklers and even Hollywood westerns of the previous decade or so. Come Drink With Me came out in 1967 in Hong Kong, of course, and of course there's the swordplay aspect, there's the swashbuckling and the adventure aspect, which I think strongly influenced by films like Captain Blood and Robin Hood of Hollywood, but then also the Western genre is something to consider when you're watching Come Drink With Me as well. I do believe that for the West, the Western genre films here in Hollywood and English-speaking countries, I think, you know, obviously they coexisted with gangster films in the 30s, noir in the 40s. The Western sat side by side with a gangster film or a noir, but I think the Western definitely outlasted them both well into the 50s. It really became the dominant American genre of the 30s through the early 60s, really. And then that's when kind of the spaghetti Western took over, and Hollywood sort of got out of that genre a little bit. But for a long time, the Western was like the American movie. And certainly, if you're watching films in the 1960s and you're seeing the popular American films that are imported into Hong Kong, you're thinking the Western. That is the American genre, and the way that we think of kung fu movies being the Hong Kong cinema genre. Now, I think China, obviously, they didn't have cowboys and Indians in Hong Kong, but they did manage to channel that energy into the Wuxia of Come Drink With Me. I recall the scene in which the main character, played by Cheng Pei Pei, the lone swordswoman, but she was appearing as a man at that time, she settles in for a solitary drink at the medieval Chinese version of a saloon before the patrons are chased out and a fight begins with the bad guys. But it feels very much like the staging that you see in a Western, where the good guy walks into the saloon, everybody sort of stops and looks up, and he sits down, and he starts having a drink all by himself, just trying to mind his own business. Somebody invariably picks a fight with him, and all hell breaks loose, and the saloon gets shot up, and that's kind of what you get here. Obviously, it's set in medieval China. There's no whiskey, but there is some kind of rice wine, I'm sure. That stuff is terrible, by the way. But I do think that in these early Hong Kong cinema films, some of which are available in the United States, like Come Drink With Me is amply available from Arrow, I think, you know, you can see that influence of earlier Hollywood films. I mean, I think they would even have shot Technicolor if they could have. Now, things turned a little bit in the 70s. There was a little bit more of an Eastern influence on Hollywood that started in the very early 1970s. You guys all know what I'm about to say. We owe this to Bruce Lee. Enter the Dragon, obviously, that's the big one. But even before that, The Invincible Boxer, which was also known, I think, here in the United States as the Five Fingers of Death, was released here, I think, 72, and that was huge. It was very popular, obviously. Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon came out right around the same. I think Enter the Dragon might have been 73, but regardless, this is kind of the first few years of the 70s. Kung Fu with David Carradine was on television. It really was becoming kind of a household name. Like, people knew what Kung Fu was. At least some people knew what Kung Fu was. And so there was a very brief period in that early 70s where Hong Kong chop socky movies were being shown in the United States, big cities in the United States, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, undoubtedly LA, cities like London, Paris. I mean, you could go see chop socky kung fu movies in the theaters in the early 70s. And that was unknown before that. That was unprecedented before that. This is kind of that first wave of Hong Kong films coming in and Westerners showing an interest in those and going to see those here in the West. Now, it was relatively short-lived, this wave, this first wave, this influence was relatively short-lived. Kung Fu, the television show with David Carradine, only had a couple of seasons. I think it only went 2, maybe 3 seasons max, and that third season might have been cut a little short. Obviously, Bruce Lee passed away. He died tragically and very early in his life. And so that kind of put an end to things a little bit, at least for the time being. And in fact, chop socky movies became parody by the end of the decade. You look at something like the Kentucky Fried Movie from 1977, and they have that long Fistful of Yen segment there, which I guess the title also refers to those Italian spaghetti westerns I mentioned a second ago, but that Fistful of Yen segment, and that might even be an acknowledgement of the influence that westerns had on other nations, that the Italians went and started producing westerns, and we called them spaghetti westerns, and those westerns also had an influence on Hong Kong cinema, and what you got is a Fistful of Yen, which is just this strange conglomeration of images there from the title. But you know, you had that Fistful of Yen segment, that parody. You had They Call Me Bruce a few years later. I think that was like 80, 81, somewhere in there for They Call Me Bruce. So by the end of the 70s, it really was kind of parodied. It was the silliness, the kind of over-the-top, bombastic nature of a kung fu movie. You know, shit you take perfectly seriously, like Enter the Dragon. Yeah, there's going to be this Han guy with one hand, and he constantly switches it out, and he's having this huge secret martial arts tournament, and the CIA wants Bruce Lee to go undercover. Like, the whole thing already sounds like a parody. I'm describing a serious film with a serious story that you're supposed to take seriously, but obviously it sounds like parody. Like, if you just came out of a coma today and you'd never seen Enter the Dragon and I just described it to you, you would think I was making up a comedy film. You'd think I was high and that I was making up something funny, because you're like, that sounds like a parody. Obviously, I think to some degree, the Socky film was ripe for parody, and we saw that in the late 70s and very early 80s. And by that point, there was really no serious effort to bring in any Hong Kong films. There were a few smaller distributors that would license these things for peanuts, and they'd show them in these, like, you know, the urban grindhouse theaters in New York. They still got some play. I mean, ask the guys from Wu-Tang. They grew up on the stuff. But as we moved into the 80s, really what dominated in that sphere of films, action films, was that Hollywood action of the 80s that we're all so familiar with and so fond of, really. Raymond Chow, the head of Golden Harvest, he took a few cracks in the early 80s at trying to launch Jackie Chan to a Western audience. He did Cannonball Run, I think, in 80 or 81. He did The Big Brawl in 80 or 81, right around the same time, 80, 81, those very early years of the 80s. He took a couple of cracks at, you know, co-producing, co-financing with American studios as well, Cannonball Run and The Big Brawl, and they didn't really take. It didn't really do much for 80s action fans to see Jackie Chan, at least in those two films. I just don't think the world was ready for it yet. Stallone, Arnold, they were huge. I mean, along with some others, there were some other 80s guys that were huge too, and they didn't use martial arts. I mean, that's not what it was about at that time. I mean, even Chuck Norris, he leaned into the guns and explosions and like that paramilitary styling of that period of time, despite being a classically trained martial artist himself. He was a classically trained martial artist as much as someone like Bruce Lee was, somebody like Jackie Chan was, and yet here he was making movies like Invasion USA, where he's on the cover doing the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing with two Uzis. He's not in a traditional gi practicing. He's got a headband on his head, nothing like that. I mean, The Karate Kid might have been your most serious attempt at Hollywood doing a actual non-parody treatment of martial arts and martial arts study in the 80s. But the spectacle in the 80s, it wasn't about like that athletic precision and those lithe fighting styles and like the zen and the sort of inner calm and harmony juxtaposed with the violence that you see from a Bruce Lee movie or something like that. The combat spectacle was really about like the guns, the Uzis, the machine guns, the explosions, the over-the-top corny dialogue that we all remember. I mean, there's a reason I yell at my kids to get to the chopper. I just think that the you know, the Cold War era films of the 80s, they leaned into like a heavy patriotic sentiment, and I think that Hong Kong cinema was simply too foreign to jive with what was popular in action cinema in the 1980s. Like I said, I don't think people were ready for it yet. They wanted a certain flavor because of that Cold War hype. They wanted something paramilitary and patriotic and big, strong American dudes with tons of muscles blowing the shit out of everybody. Now, the burgeoning home video market of the 1980s, much has been said about how VHS helped explode this whole new industry with this home video market in the 80s. The mom and pop movie store, movie rental store, was just really blowing up through the 80s. I mean, getting more and more popular as the 80s went on because you could rent these things. It was lovely. I think that burgeoning home video market did help keep martial arts movies like Enter the Dragon, Black Belt Jones, and other stuff discoverable. Like, they were still there. You could go get a VHS of Enter the Dragon at some point in the 80s, and it sort of kept it alive a little bit. It allowed people to discover it or to revisit it. But I think they kind of remained niche through the 80s. It wasn't a big thing. You might have had a few dedicated fans still, but it wasn't like a widespread thing the way it had been a decade earlier in the early 70s. But I will say Hollywood films were a tremendous export during this time. Hollywood films were traveling abroad, including to Hong Kong, where undoubtedly Hong Kongers were watching a lot of American films every single year. A Hong Konger was far more likely to be aware of Predator, for instance, for a late 80s film, than an American was to be aware of The Killer at that time. I mean, if you're talking about like late 80s, they knew about the Predator, but we didn't necessarily know about The Killer, at least not yet. We would in a few years, but not right when it was brand new. Now, the Iron Angels trilogy, which was recently released by Vinegar Syndrome, does offer up some great example of like high 80s films. I think those films came out in like 88, 89. And they're that high 80s, you know, very late 80s films that clearly show an influence of the big 80s action zeitgeist. I mean, go watch Iron Angels trilogy and tell me that they weren't influenced by shit like Rambo 2 and Commando and stuff like that. You can't convince me that the people that made Iron Angels were not aware of the action zeitgeist in the West, in Hollywood. So I think that's a great example of films that were influenced by action films. And you know, John Woo is another great example. I mentioned The Killer just a second ago. John Woo is an important filmmaker that we can point to for looking at and understanding the influence of Western films on Hong Kong filmmakers. The Killer is an example I'll point to because it's from this time period. And John Woo has been fairly explicit about his influences. So The Killer especially, but all of John Woo's films owe a great debt to the 60s crime films of Jean-Pierre Melville. For The Killer, it is specifically Les Samurai that John Woo is referencing, and he's very explicit about this. John Woo has been very open about the influence of Melville's kind of cool, smoky, noirish crime films of the 60s. I think Les Samurai came out the same year as Come Drink With Me. I think it was 67. And John Woo had ample access to these growing up in Hong Kong. These were films that were shown in the cinemas. I know it's not a Hollywood film, it's a French film. Nonetheless, it is a Western film being shown in a Hong Kong cinema that John Woo was very well familiar with Melville's work. John Woo also states that he was influenced by the Raymond Chandler style noirish hard-boiled crime fiction. That's another both literary and film influence for John Woo, and that should come as no surprise to anybody viewing his action movies. And then finally, Hollywood musicals were an influence on Woo, as stated by Woo himself. And it's kind of fucked up that the choreographed polish of somebody like Gene Kelly turned into the choreographed polish of Chow Yun-fat shooting Chinese gangsters in the face. But God bless John Woo for that shit, because I'm glad we have it. This one's for you, buddy. Not that bottle. This bottle. So it's obvious that filmmakers in Hong Kong in the 80s did feel an influence of the films from the West that had been imported, French films as well as Hollywood films, gangster traditions, visual motifs, imagery that they brought into their films. And even if they weren't having a great influence on Hollywood in the 1980s, it was coming. It was coming. Shit was about to turn around in short order. We had a second Hong Kong cinema import here in the 90s. And, you know, the big jingoistic action cycle of the 80s had to end at some point, right? No film movement lasts forever. It's just the nature of time. People grow older, filmmakers retire, die out, new ones come in to take their place. It's bound to happen. With the 90s came a new boom of independent films made here in the US, but they weren't Hollywood studio films, at least not at first. Guys like Quentin Tarantino, who was relatively young at that time, he was popping off with shit like Reservoir Dogs and then Pulp Fiction a couple years later. And as far as I'm concerned, for my money, Quentin Tarantino is the poster boy for filmmakers who were strongly influenced by and frequently pay homage to the films that they grew up with. Quentin Tarantino is very open about the films that he watched, that he consumed, that then became part of his film language that he would then turn around and create his own thing with. And while I mentioned Tarantino because I think he's uniquely responsible for, at least in large part, for that late 90s to mid-aughts resurgence of Hong Kong cinema popularity in the United States, I also think that by the early 90s to mid-90s, the US was just ready for Hong Kong shit. We were largely done with the big Cold War Hollywood spectacle. Cold War ended in 1991. I mean, we needed to find a new action movie vibe in the early 90s there, and Commando wasn't doing it. Rambo wasn't doing it. We needed to find something new. And sure, we still had Stallone producing stuff like Demolition Man. Lord knows, into the early 90s, Arnold was still going strong. I think T2 came out in 1992-ish, maybe 93, but somewhere in that territory. And so early 90s, we were still seeing some pretty damn big hits from the action stars that we had loved the previous decade. But even still, that vibe, that wave was coming down, right? We were coming off of that wave, and by 93, 94, 95, Tarantino was popping off, other independent cinema was blowing up, Miramax was coming around for better or worse, sorry ladies, but you know, Harvey Weinstein was coming around, dick all the way out, trying to make some moves in Hollywood, you know what I'm saying? And so, you know, John Woo, he started making Hollywood films in 1993 with Hard Target, then he made Broken Arrow a year or two later, and that culminated his work, I think, in the United States, kind of at least hit its high water mark with Face Off. I think that was John Woo's high water mark. It wasn't his last film in the United States, but that was certainly his high water mark for Hollywood films made by John Woo. And you know, during that time, you know, the mid to late, probably right around 96, Hollywood imported Jackie Chan films. Rumble in the Bronx, I think, was early 96. Super Cop was either later in 96 or 97. But that was a prelude to Rush Hour and Rush Hour 2. During this time, Chow Yun-fat made The Replacement Killers, I think, in 98, and The Corruptor the next year, I believe. And then you've got Jet Li appearing as the main baddie in Lethal Weapon 4. I mean, that's a 80s ass franchise that got warmed over and slightly reinvigorated by one of the stalwart kung fu actors of Hong Kong cinema. And so when I sit back and consider 1998, right? So they started popping off in the mid-90s, 95, 96. I think Ringo Lam made a film with Jean-Claude Van Damme in 1995. So, or it was Tsui Hark? It might have been Tsui Hark. At any rate, 95, 96 was really when they started that first wave. Jackie Chan came over, Rumble in the Bronx came out, blew my little mind right out of my ear holes. I went to see Rumble in the Bronx in the theaters when it was brand new, damn it. But I think about 1998. Let's just rewind the clock. Consider 1998. Lethal Weapon 4 comes out with Jet Li. Rush Hour comes out with Jackie Chan. The Replacement Killers comes out with Chow Yun-fat. Face Off had just come out the previous year in 1997. The Matrix drops the next year in 1999, and that had a heavy-ass Hong Kong influence with Yuen Woo-ping doing the fight choreography for The Matrix. And so if the 80s was a decade that Hollywood action influenced Hong Kong cinema, then the 90s was a decade absolutely characterized by the mass import and influence of Hong Kong cinema. We were lapping that shit up. I don't know if you guys out there, if you're as old as me or older, you remember, we were lapping that shit up in the late 90s. 97, 98, 99, what a banger trilogy of years right there. 97 with Face Off, 98 with all the shit I just mentioned, 99 with The Matrix. It was like boom, boom, boom. Every single damn weekend it felt like there was shit that you could go see starring or made by somebody from Hong Kong that you were loving on VHS not 3 or 4 years earlier. At the same time, Pulp Fiction came out, Reservoir Dogs came out, we were discovering that shit on VHS. We were discovering The Killer on VHS. We were discovering Bruce Lee on VHS. I was watching Enter the Dragon in 1993, 1994, seeing that shit on TV, and then going and seeking out the Bruce Lee movies at the Blockbuster. That's exactly how it went down. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, and every single one of these motherfuckers has got a movie in the movie theaters. Can you imagine how much I was in heaven? And other kids like me that just loved the shit out of some Hong Kong cinema. We was in heaven, dog. That shit was awesome. As somebody who's viciously into Hong Kong cinema at that time, I remember going to see, I saw every single one of those movies I just listed in the theaters. Starting with Rumble in the Bronx, and I went to see every single movie. If it was directed by or starred somebody from Hong Kong cinema, I was going to see that bitch in the theaters. I didn't care if I had to slit someone's throat and sneak in. I would have crept up behind them and broke their neck like a Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, right? Just grab the chin and just twist that shit. I was getting in to see that movie for sure. And so, you know, by the time that Chop Socky DNA shows up in The Matrix, and obviously, The Matrix becomes like the cultural benchmark of the 90s, at least of the latter 90s. I mean, if some of the more grungy Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, especially was the zeitgeist of the early 90s, The Matrix was every bit the cultural milestone of the later 90s. And for me, I mean, it just seemed like Hong Kong cinema fans were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave, to quote Hunter S. Thompson. It just seemed like Western movies were finally accepting the insane entertainment value of Hong Kong cinema, and that Hong Kong cinema filmmakers were going to be part of the big show from now on. And now it's all over.
And now it's all over.
John Woo directed Mission Impossible 2, which was released in the year 2000. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. This is one that I couldn't believe when I Googled it the other day. It came out at the end of 2000, came out in December of 2000. That's a 2000 film, I can't believe it. Romeo Must Die came out in 2000. Rush Hour 2 was released in 2001. We went into the 21st century absolutely thinking this shit was gonna last forever. We had buddy cop action movies, gritty urban martial arts flicks. We had big budget action spectacles starring Hollywood royalty being directed by a Hong Kong cinema auteur. And we even had critical acclaim in Crouching Tiger. This shit was winning Academy Awards. Everybody was recognizing, everybody was paying homage. The utter fucking dominance of Hong Kong cinema style with Hollywood resources seemed unstoppable. And then everybody just kind of fucked right back off to Hong Kong. It's harder to say precisely why this happened. At the same time, I remember the movies started sucking. And this was, for me, I very much remember when these movies kind of started to feel like they were falling off. Maybe it's similar to what things felt like in the superhero genre post-Endgame, how it felt like you hit that high water mark and then everything after Endgame just kind of feels meh at best and pretty terrible at worst. And I remember feeling something similar for the martial arts and Hong Kong influenced films of that time. I was a huge Jackie Chan fan. He was my man's from Jump with Rumble in the Bronx. I love Jackie Chan. But after Rush Hour 2, he makes The Tuxedo, then Shanghai Nights, then The Medallion, then Around the World in 80 Days. my mind was so full of fuck with this string of donkey shit. And Jackie didn't even make another Hollywood film until the abysmal Rush Hour 3 in 2007. Can you believe that? He goes from around the world in 80 days, takes a couple of years off to go make movies in Hong Kong, and then comes back with Rush Hour 3? That's not it, dog. And by that time, you know, by '07, you could really tell. By Rush Hour 3, you could really tell the party was over. It had been a little bit more than a decade since Jackie Chan blew up in Rumble in the Bronx, and it seemed like kung fu movies were no longer fresh and exciting. And I think that's probably what happened. They started making shit like The Tuxedo. Guy puts on a suit that helps him do kung fu. That's so dumb. What kind of dumb idea is a guy who puts on a suit to fight crime? That's so stupid. That wouldn't become popular a few years later. And I gotta say, Jet Li's films, at least his US films, felt similarly hit or miss. I don't think really any of his US films lived up to his Hong Kong work. He makes The One, then Hero, then Cradle to the Grave. Watch these three movies and then pick the one that isn't a big old pile of guerrilla shit. As for John Woo, I wanted to like Paycheck, I really did. Wind Talkers was laughably bad. Wind Talkers is unbearably bad. Like cotton swab in your pee hole to check you for chlamydia bad. That was how bad Wind Talkers was. And at least the swab in the pee hole is over pretty quickly. Wind Talkers was like 2.5 hours. Get out of here with that shit. John Woo pieced the fuck out of Hollywood so hard, he didn't come back and make another film for 20 years in the United States. He pieced out real hard after Wind Talkers, man. And you know, you think back to the early aughts, and you had shit like The Bourne Identity popping off and coming out and being real popular. And that had this kind of shaky cam realism and no frills, kind of realistic MMA style fights. They weren't really beautiful fights to look at anymore. They were kind of rugged and sort of gnarly and just kind of yuck. But that's what was popular. So that's what Hollywood was going to make, damn it. They weren't going to make more medallions or tuxedos. Thank the dear sweet Jesus they didn't make more of that shit than they actually did. Now, superhero movies also are starting to pop off around this time. X-Men comes out in 2000. X-Men 2 came out in '03. Batman Begins came out in '05. Iron Man and The Dark Knight both dropped in 2008. And there was no going back to kung fu movies after that. After '08 drops The Dark Knight. That was a serious contender for best film of all time. Motherfuckers realized the superhero genre now has chops, like they can be good movies, and like Iron Man, they can make a boatload of dough too. So I think, you know, franchising filmmaking got on steroids at that point. Hollywood was trying to make $1 billion per movie, and the Chinese box office, honestly, was a big part of that. So I think, you know, what you see after that, after '08, and the superhero genre kicking off and $1 billion film being like a real aspiration, you don't see a lot of these mid-budget action movies. They start to die out as superhero movies and franchise filmmaking start to take over. I mean, go back and look at a successful movie from the mid-'80s. You'll see some movie, it was the top 10 grossing movie of the year, it was super successful, and it had like a world gross box office take of like $150 million. And you'll just scratch your head and you'll think, what kind of fucked up shit is this? A movie from 1985 made $150 million worldwide, and that was considered tremendous success by then? Like, that's the amount of money they spent on craft services for the fucking Marvels. Like, the spend then versus now is just so different. And obviously we've got to adjust for inflation on the 150 million, but regardless, the bar for fiscal success for a movie got so fucked up and out of control after the Avengers and after the superhero movies started making $1 billion each. It got so fucked up and out of control. And franchise filmmaking didn't make the shit any better. People weren't going to take any chances on a one-off kung fu movie with Jackie Chan in it. The heyday for kung fu films is past us, my friends. And I think much like the sun is setting on the superhero genre now. But, you know, the silver lining is that, as with all genres of yesteryear, gangster films, noirs, westerns, musicals even, now the Socky movie can be added to that list. There are occasional resurgences. I mean, films that remind us of the glory days of yore for that genre. Every now and again, you get films like Hostiles, Del Toro's Nightmare Alley, The Irishman, La La Land, Everything Everywhere All at Once had some kung fu in it. And Everything Everywhere All at Once I mentioned because that's proof that Hong Kong actors can still achieve the highest recognition in the U.S. film industry. I never would have thought Michelle Yeoh. I mean, she didn't get anything for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And when she didn't win anything for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, I thought for sure, Michelle Yeoh ain't never gonna win an Academy Award. Best Actress? Hell no, dog. Ain't never gonna happen. But it happened. So that just goes to show you two things. A, what the fuck do I know? Clearly nothing. B, anything can happen. And there's still, I think, some space for Hong Kong cinema actors, filmmakers to have some impact even today. Jackie Chan is still doing work, of course. It's a lot of voice acting work, but thanks a lot, Kung Fu Panda. But he's been promising us Rush Hour 4 for almost 20 damn years. And maybe they'll give him an Oscar for that. Maybe Jackie Chan can win an Oscar next. Jackie Chan was in The Foreigner a few years back with Pierce Brosnan, in which he actually fucking acted. There was no Socky in that movie at all. And that was actually pretty good. I thought, okay, Jackie Chan, he did it. Maybe he's not winning an Academy Award for it, but this is not bad. He didn't tell a joke. He didn't crack one smile in that whole damn movie either. It was a weird one for Jackie Chan because you expect a little humor and you expect somebody to get kicked in the head, and there was none of that. No humor, nobody getting kicked in the head at all. John Woo made his first Hollywood film in 20 years with Silent Night. That was just a couple of years ago. So I think there's still room, like I said a second ago, for Hong Kong auteurs to do some work over here in Hollywood, even if they're not the hot shit they were in 1998. And really, the thing about a two-way exchange of influence like what Hollywood and Hong Kong have engaged in over the past 65-ish years, the real thesis of this video is that localizing Hong Kong films like Rumble in the Bronx for an American audience, or hiring Hong Kong talent like John Woo to come over here and do some work, that's only part of the story. Lasting influence is evident in the dispersion of ideas, motifs, themes, visual language, in the way that samurai films, notably The Hidden Fortress, influenced George Lucas in his creation of the original Star Wars. The hard-boiled action films of John Woo and Ringo Lam can be felt in recent films like the John Wicks, for example. Also, a film like Paper Tigers, much less seen than the John Wick films, but Paper Tigers feels like very much a callback to that 1990s era of kung fu movies as well. Feels like something that could have been made in 1998, that magical year. Oof. While films like Shang-Chi definitely wanted some of that Crouching Tiger, Hidden flavor to rub all over their film, right? They were trying to make a sweet and sour superhero film, baby. And so you get a little Hong Kong cinema in that as well. Hell, they had Hong Kong actor Tony Leung in that film. He's worked with John Woo. He's done big shit in Hong Kong in previous decades. And so casting him in Shang-Chi, I think, was a very knowing nod to people like me who were going to recognize. So in closing, I think that I have briefly, mostly briefly, but convincingly established a historical precedent for a two-way influence between Hollywood and Hong Kong, citing specific films that you can check out for yourself. If you don't believe me, go watch the movies I mentioned today. I think this is part of the fun of doing like a themed month, having a Socky November. I think part of the fun is that I had plenty of time to check out a wide variety of films within this theme. And also, you know, there's a thing or two to be learned about film history in the process, which I think is great. It really does help increase the depth of your appreciation of these films if you can take some time to contemplate how all of this stuff fits and works together. And the nostalgia factor didn't hurt either. I mean, God, 98. Ooh-wee. Those were the days, man. Going to the movie theater was fun back then. Damn. I miss movies. Anyway, I enjoyed the hell out of the Chop Socky November, you bunch of Hong Kong fooies. I've barely scratched the surface of my collection. I still have a huge pile of unwatched Hong Kong cinema films, and I guess they ain't going anywhere. And there's always December. I'm gonna keep them going. I just got The Killer. I got that about a week early. Got it a few days ago, and I can tell you it looks good too. So I'm pleased with the work that Shout is doing in their Hong Kong Cinema Classics line. I'm gonna keep buying those if they keep doing the good work. I gotta tell you, I've been very pleased with how that stuff's turning out. So I'm gonna chug the rest of this and go kick it at my crib watching the bonus features. Thanks to these fools, the patrons, I drink the rest of this in honor of you guys. Don't get karate chopped. Peace, fools. I'm out.